It seems no coincidence that Shakespeare wrote these narrative poems at a time when the theaters were closed because of the plague, a contagious epidemic disease that devastated the population of London. When the theaters reopened in 1594, Shakespeare apparently resumed his double career of actor and playwright and began his long and seemingly profitable service as an acting company shareholder. Records for December of 1594 show him to be a leading member of the Lord Chamberlain's men. It was this company of actors, later named the King's Men, for whom he would be a principal actor, dramatist, and shareholder for the rest of his career. So far as we can tell, that career spanned about 20 years. In the 1590s, he wrote his plays on English history, as well as several comedies and at least 2 tragedies, Titus Andronicus and Romeo and Juliet. These histories, comedies, and tragedies are the plays credited to him in 1598 in a work, Pallidis Thamia, that in one chapter compares English writers with Greek, Latin, and Italian poets. There, the author Francis Maris claims that Shakespeare is comparable to the Latin dramatist Seneca for tragedy and Plautus for comedy, and calls him the most excellent in both kinds for the stage. He also names him mellifluous and honey-tongued Shakespeare. I say, writes Maris, that the muses would speak with Shakespeare's fine, filed phrase if they would speak English. Since Maris also mentions Shakespeare's sugared sonnets among his private friends, it is assumed that many of Shakespeare's sonnets not published until 1609 were also written in the 1590s. In 1599, Shakespeare's company built a theater for themselves across the river from London, naming it the Globe. The plays that are considered by many to be Shakespeare's major tragedies, Hamlet, Othello, King Lear, and Macbeth, were written while the company was resident in this theater, as were such comedies as Twelfth Night and Measure for Measure. Many of Shakespeare's plays were performed at court both for Queen Elizabeth I and after her death in 1603 for King James I. Some were presented at the Inns of Court, the residences of London's legal societies, and some were doubtless performed in other towns, at the universities and at great houses when the King's Men went on tour. Otherwise, his plays from 1599 to 1608 were, so far as we know, performed only at the Globe. Between 1608 and 1612, Shakespeare wrote several plays, among them The Winter's Tale and The Tempest, presumably for the company's new indoor Blackfriars Theatre, though the plays seem to have been performed also at the Globe and at court. Surviving documents describe a performance of The Winter's Tale in 1611 at the Globe, for example, and performances of The Tempest in 1611 and 1613 at the Royal Palace of Whitehall. Shakespeare wrote very little after 1612. The year in which he probably wrote King Henry VIII, it was at a performance of Henry VIII in 1613 that the Globe caught fire and burned to the ground. Sometime between 1610 and 1613, he seems to have returned to live in Stratford-upon-Avon, where he owned a large house and considerable property, and where his wife and his 2 daughters and their husbands lived. His son, Hamnet, had died in 1596. During his professional years in London, Shakespeare had presumably derived income from the acting company's profits as well as from his own career as an actor. From the sale of his play manuscripts to the acting company and, after 1599, from his shares as an owner of the Globe. It was presumably that income, carefully invested in land and other property, which made him the wealthy man that surviving documents show him to have become. It is also assumed that William Shakespeare's growing wealth and reputation played some part in inclining the crown. In 1596, to grant John Shakespeare, William's father, the coat of arms that he had so long sought, William Shakespeare died in Stratford on April 23, 1616, according to the epitaph carved under his bust in Holy Trinity Church, and was buried on April 25th. 7 years after his death, his collected plays were published as Mr. William Shakespeare's Comedies, Histories, and Tragedies, the work now known as the First Folio. The years Shakespeare wrote were among the most exciting in English history. Intellectually, the discovery, translation, and printing of Greek and Roman classics were making available a set of works and worldviews that interacted complexity with Christian texts and beliefs. The result was a questioning, a vital intellectual ferment that provided energy for the period's amazing dramatic and literary output, and that fed directly into Shakespeare's plays. The ghost in Hamlet, for example, is wonderfully complicated in part because he is a figure from Roman tragedy, the spirit of the dead returning to seek revenge, who at the same time inhabits a Christian hell or purgatory. Hamlet's description of humankind reflects at one moment the Neoplatonic wonderment at mankind. What a piece of work is a man! And at the next, the Christian disparagement of human sinners, and yet to me, what is the quintessence of dust? As intellectual horizons expanded, so also did geographical and cosmological horizons. New worlds, both North and South America, were explored, and in them were found human beings who lived and worshipped to ways radically different from those of Renaissance Europeans and Englishmen. The universe, during these years, also seemed to shift and expand. Copernicus had earlier theorized that the Earth was not the center of the cosmos, but revolved as a planet around the sun. Galileo's telescope, created in 1609, allowed scientists to see that Copernicus had been correct. The universe was not organized with the Earth at the center, nor was it so nicely circumscribed as people had until that time thought. In terms of expanding horizons, the impact of these discoveries on people's beliefs, religious, scientific, and philosophical, cannot be overstated. London, too, rapidly expanded and changed during the years from the early 1590s to around 1610 that Shakespeare lived there. London, the center of England's government, its economy, its royal court, its overseas trade, was during these years becoming an exciting metropolis, drawing to it thousands of new citizens every year. Troubled by overcrowding, by poverty, by recurring epidemics of the plague, London was also a mecca for the wealthy and the aristocratic, and for those who sought advancement at court, or power in government, or finance, or trade. One hears in Shakespeare's plays the voices of London, the struggles for power, the fear of venereal disease, the language of buying and selling. One hears as well the voices of Stratford-upon-Avon, references to the nearby forest of Arden, to sheep herding, to small-town gossip, to village fairs and markets. Part of the richness of Shakespeare's work is the influence felt there of the various worlds in which he lived. The world of metropolitan London, the world of small-town and rural England, the world of the theatre, and the worlds of craftsmen and shepherds.